Bullies ganged up on the new Filipino kid in the parking lot, 7 against 1. "Time to learn your place," they sneered. But when the first punch came, everyone gasped. The quiet transfer student moved with lightning precision. Nobody knew they were picking a fight with a black belt champion. What happened next became a lesson no one at Westlake High would ever forget. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another story of courage and resilience from Filipino immigrants that you won't want to miss. Marco Reyes took a deep breath as he stood at the entrance of Westlake High, clutching the strap of his backpack tightly. The morning sun painted the building's facade with a golden hue, but the warmth did little to calm his nerves. He'd been in America for only 2 weeks, and the thought of navigating a new school in a foreign country made his stomach twist into knots. Back in Manila, he knew exactly where he belonged. Here, he was just another face in a sea of strangers. The hallways buzzed with activity as students rushed past, their conversations blending into a steady hum that felt overwhelming. Marco squared his shoulders and stepped inside, keeping his eyes forward. Though he wasn't tall, standing at about 5'8", his frame was lean and solid from years of training, a fact concealed beneath his simple navy blue hoodie and jeans. He'd chosen to dress modestly on purpose, hoping to blend in rather than stand out. "Room 203, Mr. Patterson, world history," Marco muttered to himself, scanning the room numbers as he moved down the corridor. The school was larger than he'd expected, nothing like his previous one in the Philippines, where everyone knew each other by name. As he turned a corner, the collision was sudden, his shoulder bumping hard against someone moving in the opposite direction. Marco instinctively regained his balance, his body responding with the coordination that had been drilled into him for years. "Watch it!" a voice snapped. Marco looked up to see a tall guy with sandy blonde hair and an expensive-looking jacket glaring at him. This was Ethan Donovan, though Marco wouldn't learn his name until later. What he did recognize immediately was the type, someone used to others moving out of his way. "Sorry," Marco said quietly, stepping aside. Ethan didn't move. Instead, his eyes narrowed as he took in Marco's appearance lingering on his face. "You're new," he said. It wasn't a question. Before Marco could respond, 2 more guys appeared behind Ethan. One was tall and athletic with dark hair, the other shorter with a stocky build. They flanked Ethan like bodyguards, their posture casual but their eyes alert. "Who's this?" asked the taller one. "New kid," Ethan replied, still watching Marco. "Doesn't talk much." Marco met Ethan's gaze steadily but remained silent. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the best response was no response at all. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, his tone somewhere between curious and challenging. "Marco Reyes," he answered simply. "Reyes?" The stocky one smirked. "Let me guess. Mexican?" Marco shook his head. "Filipino," he corrected, his voice calm but firm. "Filipino," Ethan repeated, as if testing the word. His lips curled into the beginning of a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, welcome to Westlake, Filipino boy. Hope you learn the rules quick." The dismissal was clear. They moved past Marco, the stocky one deliberately bumping his shoulder, as they went. Marco didn't react, simply adjusted his backpack and continued walking, but he could feel their eyes on his back. By lunch, Marco had figured out the unwritten rules of Westlake High. Ethan Donovan wasn't just popular, he was royalty. His father was some kind of tech executive, his family lived in the wealthiest neighborhood, and he'd been the school's star lacrosse player since freshman year. The tall guy was Brady Mitchell, Ethan's right-hand man and fellow lacrosse player. The stocky one was Dylan Peters, whose main qualification seemed to be his unwavering loyalty to Ethan. Marco sat alone at a corner table, eating the chicken adobo his mother had packed. He was conscious of the glances thrown his way, some curious, some dismissive. He'd experienced this before whenever he was the new kid, though there was an added layer here of being visibly different from most of his classmates. "Is this seat taken?" Marco looked up to see a girl with curly dark hair and bright, intelligent eyes, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Before he could answer, she'd already placed her tray down and sat. "I'm Sophia Chen," she said, extending her hand. Resident overachiever and self-appointed welcoming committee. Marco shook her hand, a small smile breaking through his reserved exterior. Marco Reyes. I know, Sophia replied. News travels fast here, especially when Ethan Donovan's involved. She glanced over to where Ethan and his friends sat at the center's table, commanding attention without even trying. I saw what happened this morning. Marco shrugged. It was nothing. Sophia studied him curiously. Most new kids are intimidated by them. I'm not most new kids, Marco said simply, then returned to his food. Sophia smiled, intrigued. No, she agreed. I don't think you are. She leaned forward slightly. Word of advice? Ethan doesn't like people who don't react to him. It drives him crazy when he can't get under someone's skin. Marco considered this, his eyes briefly meeting Ethan's across the cafeteria. The other boy looked away first, turning to laugh at something Brady had said. Marco nodded, understanding the dynamics at play. He wasn't here to make enemies, but he wasn't going to cower either. Thanks for the warning, he told Sophia. But I'm just here to study and graduate, that's all. Sophia looked skeptical. Noble goal, but at Westlake, you don't always get to choose when you become part of the story. She nodded toward Ethan's table. Especially when they decide you're interesting. Marco's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd dealt with bullies before. The trick was to stay calm, stay centered, and avoid confrontation. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. True strength is knowing when not to fight. He hoped it wouldn't come to that. He really did. The first week at Westlake passed quickly for Marco, but not quietly. What started as sideways glances and whispers evolved into something more deliberate. In the hallway between classes, someone knocked his books from his hands. During gym, his clothes disappeared from his locker, forcing him to wear his sweaty gym clothes for the remainder of the day. Small incidents, but the message was clear. Marco wasn't surprised when Ethan and his friends cornered him by his locker on Friday afternoon. So, Filipino boy, Ethan said, leaning against the metal door. How's your first week been? Marco continued organizing his books, his movements unhurried. Fine. Just fine? Brady chimed in. Maybe we haven't been welcoming enough. Dylan snickered, moving closer. What's that accent anyway? Sounds like you've got marbles in your mouth. Marco closed his locker, turning to face them directly. Is there something you want? Ethan's eyes narrowed at Marco's calm response. Just wondering why you're so quiet all the time. What's the deal? Don't they teach you to talk where you come from? Marco remained expressionless, though his fingers tightened slightly around the strap of his backpack. I talk when I have something to say. Oh, he does have a spine, Brady mocked, looking at Ethan. Didn't think they made them like that in the Philippines. Marco's mind flashed back to his grandfather's dojo in Manila, the worn mats and mirrored walls where he'd spent countless hours perfecting his craft. He remembered the first tournament he'd won at 12, the weight of the medal against his chest, his grandfather's proud smile. Excuse me, Marco said calmly, moving to walk past them. Dylan stepped in front of him, blocking his path. We're not done talking to you. Marco stood perfectly still, his body balanced and ready, though no one watching would have noticed the subtle shift in his stance. I have to catch my bus. What's the rush? Ethan moved closer, his height advantage allowing him to look down at Marco. We're just getting to know each other. Marco thought about his mother waiting at home, how she'd uprooted her life so he could have better opportunities after his father's passing 3 years ago, how proud she'd been when he won the regional black belt championship last year, defeating opponents much larger than himself with technique and precision rather than brute force. Another time, Marco said, his voice level but firm. Something in his tone made Ethan hesitate. There was a confidence there that didn't match the quiet new kid persona. For a brief moment, confusion flickered across Ethan's face. Whatever, Ethan finally said, stepping aside. See you Monday, Filipino boy. As Marco walked away, he could hear them laughing, but he didn't look back. His grandfather's voice echoed in his head. Your body is a weapon. Like any weapon, you must know when to keep it sheathed. At home, his mother noticed his preoccupation immediately. Rosa Reyes had always been perceptive, especially when it came to her only son. Bad day? She asked in Tagalog as she set a plate of pancit in front of him. Marco shook his head, forcing a smile. Just adjusting. His mother sat across from him, her eyes kind but knowing. I saw you practicing your forms last night. You haven't done that in weeks. Marco focused on his food. Just staying sharp. Your Lolo would be proud of how you've maintained your discipline, she said, referring to his grandfather. But he would also remind you that with your skills comes responsibility. Marco nodded, remembering the countless lessons. His grandfather had been a renowned martial arts instructor in Manila, training police officers and competitors alike. From the age of 5, Marco had been in the dojo, learning not just techniques but philosophy. There are some boys at school, Marco finally admitted. Nothing serious. His mother's expression turned concerned. Are they bullying you? Marco thought about Ethan's smug face, the deliberate provocations. They're trying to. And his mother studied him carefully. And nothing, Marco replied firmly. I'm handling it. Rosa reached across the table, squeezing his hand. I know we came here for opportunities you wouldn't have had in Manila, but never forget who you are, Anak. You are not just my son. You are your grandfather's legacy. Marco squeezed back, grateful for her understanding. His mother had supported his training from the beginning, driving him to competitions across the Philippines, celebrating his victories and comforting him through rare defeats. She understood what the discipline meant to him, not just the physical skills, but the mental fortitude. That night, Marco stood in their small backyard, moving through forms that had become second nature. Each movement was precise, controlled, the product of thousands of hours of practice. He thought about Ethan and his friends, their attempts to intimidate him, to make him feel small. In the Philippines, he'd been respected as a student, as an athlete, as his grandfather's protege. Here, they saw only what they wanted to see, a quiet foreign kid they could push around. They had no idea that beneath his calm exterior was a champion with more discipline in his little finger than they had in their entire bodies. Monday would come, and with it, more challenges. Marco knew the pattern. Ethan wouldn't stop until he got a reaction. But Marco wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Not yet. Not until he had no choice. By Wednesday of the second week, the cafeteria had become a battleground. Marco sat at his usual corner table, opening the container of kare-kare his mother had prepared. The rich peanut sauce and tender oxtail had always been one of his favorite dishes, a comfort food that reminded him of Sunday family gatherings in Manila. He was just taking his first bite when Ethan and his crew approached, sliding into the empty seats around him without invitation. What's that smell? Dylan wrinkled his nose dramatically. Dude, are you eating dog or something? Marco continued eating, refusing to acknowledge the taunt. I asked you a question, Dylan pressed, leaning closer. It's kare-kare, Marco finally said. Oxtail stew. Brady reached across the table, poking at the food with his finger. Looks like someone already ate it and threw it back up. Laughter erupted from nearby tables as other students turned to watch. Marco set down his fork, his face expressionless despite the anger building inside him. His grandfather had always emphasized control, emotional and physical. The moment you lose your temper, he'd say, you've already lost the fight. Don't you have anything better to do? Marco asked quietly. Ethan smirked. Then educate you on proper American food? Consider it our community service. In one quick motion, he grabbed Marco's container and turned it upside down, dumping the contents onto the table. The peanut sauce splattered across Marco's shirt and the table, drawing gasps and more laughter from onlookers. For a split second, Marco's composure cracked. His hand moved instinctively, catching Ethan's wrist before he could fully withdraw. The movement was so fast that Ethan barely registered what had happened until he felt the pressure on his arm. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Ethan saw something shift in Marco's gaze, a flash of controlled fury that made him suddenly uncertain. Marco released his grip almost immediately, but the damage was done. Ethan had felt the strength in those fingers, seen the reflexes that didn't match the quiet kid persona. "Don't touch my food again," Marco said, his voice low but clear. Ethan stood up, attempting to recover his bravado. "Or what? You'll cry to your mommy?" "Just don't," Marco repeated, beginning to clean up the mess with napkins. "Let's go," Ethan muttered to his friends, uncomfortable with how the encounter had ended. As they walked away, he called back, "Enjoy your slop, Filipino boy." That evening, Marco's mother immediately noticed his stained shirt and quiet demeanor. "What happened?" she asked in Tagalog, her voice laced with concern. Marco shrugged, heading toward his room. "Nothing important." Rosa followed him, standing in the doorway as he changed his shirt. "That doesn't look like nothing." Marco sighed, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Some guys at school. They dumped my lunch." His mother's expression hardened. "These are the same boys from before?" Marco nodded. "You need to tell someone. A teacher, the principal." "That would only make it worse," Marco replied, shaking his head. "I can handle it." Rosa sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your grandfather didn't teach you martial arts so you could be pushed around, but he also taught you restraint. There's wisdom in knowing the difference between backing down and choosing not to engage." "I know, Mama," Marco said softly. "But," she continued, her voice firmer now, "there comes a point where not standing up for yourself becomes a dishonor to your own spirit. Your Lolo would say the same." Marco thought about the look on Ethan's face when he'd grabbed his wrist, the momentary flash of surprise, maybe even fear. "I don't want to fight." "Fighting should always be the last resort," his mother agreed, "but remember what Lolo always said." "A true warrior knows not only how to fight, but when to fight," Marco finished, the familiar saying bringing a small smile to his face. Later that night, Marco stood in the garage they'd converted into a small training space. A heavy bag hung from the ceiling, and training mats covered most of the floor. Marco wrapped his hands carefully before beginning his routine. Each punch was precise, each kick delivered with perfect form. He moved through combinations that had won him 3 consecutive championships back home, his body remembering what his mind sometimes wanted to forget. The discipline was still there, the power still contained within his modest frame. Across town, Ethan sat with Brady and Dylan in his family's expansive basement, nursing bruised pride and developing a plan. "That Filipino kid thinks he's tough," Ethan muttered, spinning a basketball on his finger. "Did you see how he grabbed me?" "Maybe we should just leave him alone," Brady suggested half-heartedly. "He doesn't seem worth the trouble." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "No one disrespects me like that. No one. Tomorrow we show him exactly where he stands at Westlake." None of them realized that they were planning to push a champion past his breaking point. Thursday morning arrived with an unusual tension in the air. Marco felt it the moment he stepped through Westlake's front doors. The sidelong glances, the hushed conversations that stopped when he passed, the anticipation of something brewing. Sophia caught up with him between second and third period, her expression concerned. "Watch yourself today," she warned, falling into step beside him. "Ethan's been talking. A lot." Marco nodded, unsurprised. "Thanks for the heads up." "You don't seem worried," Sophia observed, studying his face. Marco shrugged. "Worrying doesn't help anything." The confrontation came sooner than expected. As Marco rounded the corner toward his locker before lunch, he found Ethan waiting with not just Brady and Dylan, but 2 seniors Marco recognized from the lacrosse team. The hallway was crowded with students, many lingering with poorly disguised interest. "There he is," Ethan announced, pushing off from the lockers. "The tough guy who thinks he can disrespect me in front of everyone." Marco stopped several feet away, assessing the situation. 5 against 1. With the hallway offering limited mobility. Not ideal, but he'd faced worse odds in competitions. I'm not looking for trouble, Marco said evenly. Ethan scoffed. Should have thought about that yesterday. He stepped closer, invading Marco's space. You embarrassed me in front of everyone. You embarrassed yourself, Marco replied, maintaining eye contact. I just didn't let you embarrass me. A collective ooh rippled through the gathering crowd. Ethan's face flushed with anger, his composure slipping. You think you're so special with your weird food and your accent, Ethan spat. But here, you're nothing. Just another foreign kid who doesn't belong. Marco felt a familiar calm settling over him. The same feeling he got before stepping onto the competition mat. Time seemed to slow as Ethan reached out to shove him hard against the lockers. What happened next left the hallway in stunned silence. Instead of stumbling backward, Marco pivoted slightly, his body moving with the force rather than against it. His hand came up in one fluid motion, gripping Ethan's extended arm just above the elbow. Using Ethan's own momentum, Marco executed a perfect hip toss, a basic judo technique his grandfather had taught him when he was just 7 years old. Ethan's feet left the ground, his body rotating through the air before landing hard on his back with a dull thud that echoed through the now silent hallway. The wind knocked from his lungs. Ethan lay gasping like a fish out of water, his eyes wide with shock and humiliation. Marco immediately stepped back into a neutral stance, hands relaxed at his sides, but ready to move. Brady and Dylan froze, clearly unprepared for what they'd just witnessed. One of the seniors took a step forward, but hesitated when Marco shifted his gaze, something in those calm eyes making him reconsider. What is going on here? A sharp voice cut through the tension as Mr. Hernandez, the vice principal, pushed through the crowd of students. He took in the scene, Ethan still on the floor, Marco standing calmly, the circle of spectators with phones raised. He attacked me, Ethan wheezed, finally recovering his breath as he struggled to his feet. That's not what happened. Sophia stepped forward, phone in hand. I have it on video. Ethan tried to shove Marco first. Mr. Hernandez sighed deeply. Everyone disperse. Now. To the main participants, he said, Donovan, Reyes, my office. The rest of you get to class. As Marco followed the vice principal, whispers erupted behind him. The story was already spreading, how the quiet Filipino kid had just taken down Ethan Donovan, the untouchable king of Westlake, with a move straight out of a martial arts movie. In Mr. Hernandez's office, the vice principal reviewed Sophia's video, his expression growing increasingly stern. Mr. Donovan, this clearly shows you initiating physical contact. He provoked me, Ethan insisted, holding an ice pack to his shoulder. By standing at his locker? Mr. Hernandez raised an eyebrow. He disrespected me yesterday, Ethan muttered, avoiding eye contact. Mr. Hernandez turned to Marco. That move was professional. Care to explain? Marco hesitated before answering. I trained in martial arts back in the Philippines. My grandfather was my instructor. Trained how much exactly? I was a black belt champion, Marco admitted quietly. 3 years running in my division. Ethan's head snapped up, his expression a mixture of shock and newfound understanding. Mr. Hernandez leaned back in his chair, considering. Well, Mr. Reyes, while I appreciate your restraint in not actually striking Mr. Donovan, using martial arts techniques in school is still concerning. I only defended myself, Marco pointed out. I didn't hurt him. My shoulder's killing me, Ethan protested. Your pride's hurting worse, Mr. Hernandez observed dryly. You'll live. To Marco, he added, 1 day detention for fighting, which is our minimum. Consider it a warning. Mr. Donovan, you'll have 3 days suspension for initiating the physical altercation. By the time Marco left the office, the lunch period was nearly over, but the cafeteria was buzzing with excitement. Heads turned as he entered, and the usual chatter dimmed momentarily before erupting into even louder conversations. Sophia waved him over to her table, where several other students had gathered. That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen, one of them said, as Marco sat down. Where did you learn to do that? Another asked. Marco shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. My grandfather taught me. You're like what, some kind of karate master? A girl at the table pressed. Taekwondo and judo, actually, Marco corrected quietly. and I'm not a master, just well trained. On the far side of the cafeteria, Ethan sat with his diminished entourage, his usual confidence replaced by simmering anger and embarrassment. The social hierarchy of Westlake High had just been shaken to its foundation, and if the fragile peace lasted hardly 24 hours, by Friday afternoon, Marco knew something was coming. Ethan had been conspicuously absent from classes, but his friends had been watching Marco with undisguised hostility. Whispers followed him through the hallways, some admiring, some concerned. They're planning something, Sophia warned as the final bell rang. Ethan's older brother Jason and his friends are involved. They're waiting in the east parking lot. Marco sighed, securing his backpack. I need to catch my bus. Which goes through the east lot, Sophia pointed out. Be careful, okay? Marco nodded, his expression unreadable. Inside, he was running through scenarios, remembering his grandfather's teachings about multiple opponents. When facing greater numbers, Lolo would say, position is everything. Never let them surround you. The east parking lot was nearly empty when Marco reached it, most students having already departed. Then he saw them. Ethan, Brady, Dylan, and 4 older guys Marco didn't recognize, strategically positioned near the bus loading zone. Jason Donovan, Ethan's brother, was unmistakable with the same sandy hair and arrogant posture. Marco slowed his pace, scanning the area. A few students lingered nearby, watching with nervous anticipation. No teachers in sight. The buses were at the far end of the lot, and he'd have to pass directly through the group to reach them. There he is, Ethan called out, his voice carrying across the pavement. The karate kid who thinks he's so tough. Marco stopped, adjusting his stance subtly. I don't want any trouble. Jason stepped forward, a senior with the confident swagger of someone used to intimidation. Should have thought about that before you embarrassed my brother, don't you think? The group spread out, attempting to create a loose circle around Marco. He shifted immediately, backing toward the brick wall of the school building, eliminating one angle of attack. His backpack slid to the ground beside him. 7 against 1, Marco observed calmly. Is that how it works here? We're just going to teach you a lesson about respect, Jason said, cracking his knuckles theatrically. My grandfather already taught me about respect, Marco replied, his voice steady. He also taught me how to handle myself against multiple opponents. Jason laughed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Let's see about that. They moved in unison, Jason and one of his friends lunging forward first. Marco exploded into action, his movements fluid and precise. He sidestepped Jason's rush, using a sweeping leg block to knock the other attacker off balance. When Brady charged from the right, Marco countered with a textbook Arnis technique, using the attacker's momentum to send him tumbling into Dylan. Each movement flowed into the next, years of training evident in every precise counter and defensive maneuver. Marco wasn't striking to hurt. He was controlling the space, using their aggression against them. One by one, they hit the pavement, their coordination dissolving into confusion as they faced the opponent clearly operating on a different level. Within moments, 4 of them were down, and the remaining 3, including Ethan, stood frozen, reassessing the situation. A small crowd had gathered, phones recording every second. Are we done? Marco asked, not even breathing hard as he remained in a defensive stance. Jason struggled to his feet, a new respect evident in his eyes. What the hell are you? Just someone who trained hard, Marco replied. Like I said, I don't want trouble. The fight had left them, their bravado replaced by a grudging recognition of superior skill. One by one, they backed away, helping each other up. Only Ethan remained, his expression unreadable. The crowd began to disperse as a teacher finally appeared in the distance. Marco retrieved his backpack, turning to head toward the buses. Wait! Ethan called, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. Marco paused, turning back. How long? Ethan asked. How long did it take to learn to fight like that? 10 years, Marco answered honestly. Almost every day. Ethan nodded slowly, processing this. That's dedication. It's more than fighting, Marco explained. It's discipline, respect, control. I underestimated you, Ethan admitted reluctantly. We all did. Marco studied him for a moment, then offered a simple truth. Most people do. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding, and at Westlake High, that was something entirely new. The following Monday, the atmosphere at Westlake High had fundamentally changed. Marco entered the building to find students looking at him with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and a touch of awe. The whispers had transformed from mocking to admiring, with snippets of black belt champion and took down 7 guys following him through the hallways. Marco accepted the attention with quiet grace, neither seeking it nor shying away from it. At lunch, his previously empty table, filled with students eager to know more about his training and his life in the Philippines. For the first time, Marco shared stories about growing up in his grandfather's dojo, the early morning training sessions, and the philosophy behind the martial arts he had mastered. In the Philippines, martial arts isn't just about fighting, he explained to a captivated audience that now included Sophia and even Brady, who had approached with awkward apologies. It's about discipline, respect, and understanding your own strength so you never misuse it. Ethan made his way over toward the end of the period, hesitant but determined. He stood at the edge of the group until Marco noticed him and nodded toward an empty seat. I brought something, Ethan said, placing a container on the table. My mom makes decent adobo. Thought maybe you could tell me if it's authentic. It was a small gesture, but its significance wasn't lost on anyone present. Marco opened the container, the familiar aroma bringing a genuine smile to his face. It looks good, he said, offering Ethan a fork. Try it with me? That evening, Rosa Reyes noticed the change in her son immediately. The tension he'd been carrying had lifted. Things are better at school? She asked in Tagalog as they prepared dinner together. Marco nodded. I found my place, Mama, just like Lolo said I would. By fighting? She asked, raising an eyebrow. By standing my ground, Marco corrected, and then by sharing who I really am. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself or your culture? How did it change how others saw you? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of courage and cultural pride, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our new uploads. Check out our other Filipino stories appearing on your screen right now. Your next favorite could be just a click away.